Welcome to Mr. Alvarez's Virtual Chemistry Laboratory. Today we'll be performing the like dissolves like lab. Introduction. Like dissolves like is an expression that chemists use when discussing the solubility of substances. It means that, in general, nonpolar substances dissolve in nonpolar solvents, and polar substances dissolve in polar solvents. Ionic substances also dissolve in polar solvents. What determines the polarity of a molecule is a type of covalent bond that exists and the arrangement of these bonds. If all the bonds in a molecule are nonpolar, equal sharing of electrons, the molecule is definitely nonpolar. If the bonds are arranged symmetrically, the molecule will be nonpolar. If all the bonds are polar, unequal sharing of electrons, then the arrangement, shape of the bonds determines the polarity of the molecule. If all the bonds are not symmetrically arranged, the molecule will be polar. Remember this trick. SNAP, symmetrical nonpolar, asymmetrical is polar. In this experiment, we will investigate the solubility of an ionic solid and a nonpolar solid in liquids of varying polarities. Not all substances are strictly polar or nonpolar. We will also see how the liquids themselves interact. Now, we do have test tubes, sodium chloride, ethanol, test tube racks, iodine crystals, goggles, spatulas or scupulas. We have water, we have graduated cylinders, and we have hexane. But we're also going to make a couple changes to the data table. We have a few more substances. Not only do we have iodine and sodium chloride, but we also have oil, vegetable oil. We have starch. And we have copper 2 chloride. What we are going to do for this lab is we are going to place each of the 5 substances in test tubes, and we are going to see if they dissolve in water, in hexane, and in ethanol. First, we're going to take a look at water. So let's put some water in the beaker, and we'll place some water in each of the 5 test tubes. Next, we'll add, in order, a little bit of each substance. So first iodine, we'll give it time to dissolve, then sodium chloride, next we add a little bit of vegetable oil. Then we add some starch. And finally, some copper 2 chloride. If we swirl the iodine and water around, we see that the iodine is still on the bottom. It did not dissolve. So we'll write insoluble. If we take the sodium chloride, mix it around, sodium chloride did dissolve, so soluble. You know, we'll give the iodine the same treatment. We'll shake it up as well. But however, the water's still clear, the iodine's still on the bottom, did not dissolve. It's insoluble. The oil and the water is tricky to see. So what we're going to do is we'll add a little food coloring to see what happens. If we add the food coloring will mix with the water. If they're all mixed together, the whole test tube, should remain blue. If they don't dissolve into each other, then it should separate. While we wait for that, let's take a look at the starch and the water. Did not dissolve. Copper chloride in water. Copper 2 chloride in water. Turns this light blue. Did dissolve. Let's take a look back at the oil and the water. You could see that there's two separate substances. On top you have the oil, which is less dense, and on the bottom you have the water with the food coloring, the blue. The water is more dense. So let's fill out the data table. Iodine in water, insoluble. Sodium chloride in water, soluble. Vegetable oil in water, insoluble. Starch in water, insoluble. And copper 2 chloride in water is soluble. Next, we'll perform the same procedure, but this time with ethanol. So we'll pour some ethanol into a beaker. It is 70% ethanol. And we'll place roughly equal amounts, doesn't have to be perfect, roughly equal amounts of the ethanol in the 5 test tubes. 3, 4, and 5. See, we don't want to waste any of it, and we can't pour it back, so just put the rest into the test tubes. Okay. Do the same procedure. Take a little bit of iodine. Take sodium chloride. We'll take vegetable oil. We'll take starch. And we'll take the copper 2 chloride. All right. Iodine? Looks like it dissolved. Sodium chloride? Does not look like it dissolved. The oil, it's hard to tell. So let's use some food coloring and see what happens. Shake it up again. Let it sit for a second, see what happens. Then we have the starch. Looks like it's precipitating out. And the copper chloride looks like it dissolved. So let's take a look at our results. Iodine, dissolved. Sodium chloride, did not dissolve. Oil, looks like it dissolved. The Starch did not dissolve, and the copper 2 chloride did dissolve. So to recap, with the ethanol, let's move down here. Iodine, soluble. NaCl, insoluble. Vegetable oil, soluble. Starch, insoluble. And copper 2 chloride, soluble. Finally, we're going to perform the procedure one more time with hexanes. So same procedure, we pour some hexanes into the beaker, and we distribute the hexane to each of the 5 test tubes. A little bit more. And maybe a little bit more. And that should be good. All right, same procedure. Take some iodine, place it in the first beaker. Sodium chloride in the second test tube, second test tube. Some vegetable oil in the third test tube. Some starch in the fourth test tube. And some copper 2 chloride in the fifth test tube. Okay, let's check our results. Get this nice purple color with the hexane and the iodine. Second one, sodium chloride and hexane. Insoluble. Hexane and oil. Let's do the trick with So very interesting thing just happened here. I put 3 drops of the food coloring in. The food coloring went straight to the bottom. But the hexane and the vegetable oil looks uniform, so we're going to say that dissolved instead of soluble. Check the starch. Starch, insoluble, and finally, you could see the copper 2 chloride, very different from the other two, from the water and the ethanol. There is no color in the liquid, but you can see the copper chloride crystals on the bottom. So let's fill out the data table. Hexane, soluble. NaCl, sodium chloride, insoluble. Vegetable oil, soluble. Starch, insoluble across the board. And copper 2 chloride was insoluble. Finally, we're going to see which of the liquids dissolve into each other. First, we'll start off with water and hexane. It's hard to see on camera, so we'll do our trick of taking a little food coloring. And we'll let that sit for a second and see what happens. Next, we have water and alcohol, so we'll take water and ethanol. And once again, two clear liquids, so let's take our food coloring and see what happens. And while we wait, let's take a look at the alcohol and hexane. Alcohol and the hexane. And let's once again use the food coloring. You can see here that the blue food coloring went to the bottom with the water, and the hexane on top is clear. So we're not going to say insoluble since they're two liquids. Let's think about a word that we learned about in class, a vocabulary word. When you have two liquids that don't dissolve into each other, we call that immiscible. Immiscible. If they did dissolve into each other, we would say they were miscible, like water and alcohol. As you can see in the test tube, it's blue straight through. They did dissolve through, so we're going to say water and alcohol are miscible. Finally, we have the alcohol and hexane. And there's definitely a higher concentration of blue at the bottom than there is at the top. And I could definitely see two layers of liquid in there. Let's say miscible, but let's leave it and come back to it. After letting the alcohol and hexane settle for about 5 minutes, it all looks like one uniform solution. So we're going to leave our answer as miscible. Thank you for joining Mr. Alvarez's Virtual Chemistry Laboratory. Today we performed the like dissolves like laboratory experiment procedure. Thank you again for joining us. I hope you learned something today. Please join us again soon.